Thank you all for being here. I've been a fan of Douglas Holtz-Eakin for a long time. He wouldn't know that.
Nobody.
It's true. And as a businessman in a business career, and particularly when he was running the Congressional Budget Office, I always found him to be a voice of reason and someone who, when I saw him speak, could explain issues in a very coherent, compelling way. So we're thrilled to have you here.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor, and thank you for coming out tonight. It really is a privilege. And my congratulations to the Dallas Fed under your leadership.
All right, thank you.
Can I just say one thing?
Please do.
I want to thank Mark for the fantastic introduction, but that's a very gracious reading of my record. Let me tell you how my mother reads it. This is actually fantastic. I come from a long line of high school teachers, and so when I was at Syracuse and I was chairman of the department, I was a tenured full professor, I had an endowed chair, I had reached the pinnacle of professional achievement. And since then, I went to the White House where I was temporary help, to CBO where I was a government bureaucrat, and then up on the McCain campaign as a political hack.
This is according to your mother.
Yeah. Now I run a think tank, which is like an over 21 daycare center. She asks me all the time, are you looking for a job? It's like, no.
Sounds like my mom. Yeah. So let's start a little bit with you. How did you become an economist? What made you become an economist?
So I'm going to tell you this because you told me that Greg Mankiw has done one of these events.
Yes, he has.
I have been told, well, two things. Number one, Greg Mankiw was born on February 3rd, 1958 in Trenton, New Jersey.
This is the head of the economics department at Harvard. And
yes, I was born on February 3rd, 1958. We have exactly the same birthday. Yeah. I was born in Butler, Pennsylvania. I've been told Greg always wanted to be an economist. I find this shocking. I really do. I'm an economist because my senior year in college, I had a good advisor, a guy named Paul King, who pulled me aside and said, "You're not ready to have a job. You should go to graduate school." That is literally true. I was a math and econ double major, so I applied to all the math schools I could, all the econ schools I could. I got into no math schools. So I was really a computer scientist in disguise. They had all those programming classes in the math department in that era. And then I got into a couple of econ schools with a little bit of aid, but it wasn't looking great. And then fairly late in the game, Princeton admitted me with a full ride and a stipend. So they paid me to go to graduate school. So I firmly believe I became an economist because of clerical error somewhere.
What is about being an economist, and I'm not an economist, so I can ask this, what is about being an economist that you found so compelling?
So economics is a useful way to organize my thinking about the world. There are lots of different ways you can organize your thinking about the world. The world is a very complicated place. You have to simplify in some ways to sort of figure out what are the core things and what's sort of noise and day-to-day stuff. And economics has appealed to me as a way to do that, to understand very complicated phenomena and how they can be produced by fairly simple incentives. And that's a very powerful thing about economics. It doesn't make it right, it makes it useful.
And did you have an area of focus?
Yes. My initial areas were public finance, so taxes and government spending, which remains something I spent a lot of time on. Monetary theory, which was really macroeconomics in disguise in that time and age. And then U.S. economic history, which was really useful to know something about because we do, in fact, do the same silly things a lot.
Okay, yeah, we do, don't we? Sometimes worse. How did you come so you were a professor, and then how did it happen that you wound up at the Council of Economic Advisors?
So I graduated from Princeton. I got my PhD in 1985. I started at Columbia University, and two things were true. I was publishing papers in places like Econometrica, which is actually what you're supposed to do, but which nobody buys Econometrica and reads it. I mean, like, no real person has any idea what that is. And so it seemed a little sterile. And in 1985, if you were an undergraduate at Columbia University, you were a brave human being who was quite sure about yourself, because that was the largest open-air drug market in the Western Hemisphere. And so I'd be teaching classes, and they'd be ignoring me because they already knew everything I had to say and arranging their social lives. And I generally had this crisis of confidence. Like, I'm publishing these papers that no one in their right mind is going to read. These students don't care what I have to say. And so in a crisis, you always go home. So I went back to Princeton.
Yeah.
And while I was there, Harvey Rosen, my dissertation advisor and longtime co-author and friend, and John Taylor, my other mentor, both went to the first Bush administration, H.W. Bush, in 1989. And I went with them. And I went with them with the firm intent to do something real and never go back to academia. I was done. In fact, to prove that I was done, I applied to this place called the Fed. Do you know them?
I do.
Completely bizarre institution. Anyway, so I went down there, and here's the truth, and I tell people this a lot, because I think...
And just for the audience, so John Taylor is a well-known, extremely well-known Stanford professor.
Yes.
We spent a lot of time with him at the Fed.
Harvey is a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Yeah.
Probably one of the best teachers you could ever run across.
Yeah, those are two great people.
And so I was at the White House, and I found out that two things were true. Number one, I would go into these meetings. They'd be interagency meetings. You have the labor folks and the interior folks and some West Wing folks, and you're trying to sort something out. And I found that I was really teaching economics. In those meetings, I was saying things like, you don't need to worry about that. That will take care of itself. You need to...
But to policymakers.
And to people who were lawyers and to people who were strategists, people who were not economists.
Right.
But I was doing this teaching, and I realized I liked teaching economics. That I'd been right about that instinct. And the second thing I found out was that the academic research literature that I had sort of lost faith in was super important. That broadly speaking, the research, you invest a lot in research. There's a good reason to do that.
Yeah.
Because in the policy process, people can and will say anything to get what they want. And the only thing that checks them is the large amount of professional research out there that says there are a lot of things that could happen. That's not one of them. So forget it. If you cut the capital gains tax rate to 5%, you will not stop teenage pregnancy. That's not going to happen, right? I mean, so it turned out to be really important. And it gave me enough faith in the whole enterprise to go back to Syracuse and spend 12 years doing this, because no single paper matters, but the cumulative understanding that comes out of that effort is really important.
And so what brought you back to the Congressional Budget Office?
So in 2001, I went back to the CEA, I thought, for a couple of years.
Yeah.
To get 2 years leave, go work at the CEA. Glenn Hubbard was the chairman. Glenn's an old friend, and working with him was a great privilege and joy. So I was really, really pleased about that. And then toward the end of that time, again, I believe most of my life is clerical error. I was offered this CBO job. I don't know how that, I genuinely do not know how that happened. Jim Nussle, who's an Iowa Republican, was chairman of the House Budget Committee.
Yeah.
It was his search. He was the search committee. He offered me the job.
Yeah.
And it was just too good a job to pass up.
Okay, so let's just talk about, because a lot of people here, you can hear I've got the Congressional Budget Office report on my desk at all times. Just for those who don't, how many people are employed by the Congressional Budget Office?
230, roughly.
And what is the purpose, and what does it do?
The CBO was created by the Budget Act in 1974. Its purpose was to give the Congress capabilities comparable to the Office of Management and Budget. And to be able to, in any budgetary negotiation, in any budgetary deliberation, decision, have the information it needed to make that decision. And so I think of the CBO as a basically consulting firm to the Congress.
Yeah.
It is our job to inform the client of what they need to know to make the decisions.
And nonpartisan.
Yes, it is nonpartisan by statute.
Yeah.
There are two things a CBO director cannot do. They cannot give policy advice, so you can't say, I think you should.
Yeah.
That was hard on me.
Yeah.
And you can't pick sides.
And what's the most important things you learned at the Congressional Budget Office?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I learned at the personal level, I learned that I liked team research. And I think the reason I've never gone back to academia is I like the idea of running a team. My think tank now is my team. I like that. And there's just a tremendous joy in picking a research project and sort of seeing it through and seeing everyone contribute and all that. So I learned that. I learned I liked managing more than I thought I did. I learned a lot about the nature of research in the policy process, and really the early lessons that I drove home on the McCain campaign. You cannot ask a politician to put politics aside and do the right thing. That's not who they are by definition. That's crazy. So you have to somehow have good policy be good politics. And I think of myself as having devoted the bulk of the last 15 years of my life to that mission. I did learn that my belief that a better informed policymaker will make better decisions is not always true. Just saying. I thought, you just beat them to death with the information, they'll make a better decision, and that was naive.
Because you found the power of politics.
And so I had to understand the politics, and I had to. Okay. I also came to understand essentially modern political sales. I was in production. I wrote papers and stuff. That was my career. Sales is really important.
So famously, if you go back to the year 2000, for a nanosecond there, it appeared the U.S. budget was actually in balance.
Yeah.
And then we had 9/11.
It was in balance.
It was in balance.
The problem was that CBO projected that there were surpluses of 1.6 trillion as far as the eye could see.
Right.
And I spent most of my time at CBO explaining why they were wrong.
And why were they wrong?
It's really interesting. So this is a geeky moment, and I apologize. I hope you still have your wine. So you have to do these 10-year budget projections, which is a fundamentally hopeless task. But you have to do them. Congress asks them. They want a single number. They don't want ranges. So you have to give them a number. That's your job. So on the spending side, the tradition I inherited was, you ask yourself the question, when we do the projection this year, what do we know that's different about year 10? For sure. And if there is something, then we modify it. If not, then we figure out where we are, and we get to year 10 and we have the same number as last year. On the tax side, they ask the question, where are we and what do we believe the growth rates are? So they essentially always move the beginning up or down, and then the growth rates they don't believe have changed.
Right.
So we had a huge bubble in revenues in the late 90s.
Right.
Taxation of options and bonus income out of the dot-com bubble, largely. And so they had a big revenue bubble, and they extrapolated off the peak of it.
I see.
It's kind of a mistake.
Yeah. And higher GDP growth than actually was going to occur.
But it was a revenue above beyond the GDP growth. I mean, it was just there was really a big.
And that's why it looked like
miss.
there were surpluses as far as the eye could see. So based on, I remember.
And then it went away, and I had to explain why it went away. And one of my major innovations was to make sure that the spending and tax guys did business the same way.
So let's talk about that. So I remember when the new administration, there were public officials talking about a fear of a shortage of treasuries.
Running out of treasuries, yeah.
Running out of treasuries.
It was going to be terrible.
And then we had 2 wars. Not immediately, but 2 wars and a very large, at least 1 or 2 tax cuts.
Yep.
And then we got in a situation where we again had very large deficits.
Yep.
So then you had to explain that. How did you explain that?
To no one's great satisfaction.
No, I imagine not. Yeah.
But it was where I really learned about the messaging piece of this, because the facts were that if you looked at the size of the miss and you started decomposing it, the bulk of the miss, about 50% of it was economic and projection errors, essentially our estimation errors. Of the remaining 50%, the majority was on the spending side, not the tax cuts.
Okay.
And that was driven in part by the wars and things like that. But for people who wanted to, for Democrats who were unhappy with the 2001, 2003 tax cuts, that was an unpleasant message, and so they weren't happy with me. For Republicans who thought they had all this money to spend and who thought the wars had value, they didn't want to hear me talking about the spending side either. So it was one of those situations where I knew I was doing my job because nobody liked me.
And in that job, you don't have the ability to propose policies.
It's actually forbidden by law.
You're the scorekeeper.
Yes.
So you just have to give them the bad news.
Yes.
And hope that they'll take action accordingly.
Your greatest power at CBO is the power of public shaming, but we've entered a shameless era.
Right. So we're going to come back to that in a moment. So from there, you were very prominently, I remember this, advisor to John McCain in his presidential run. And if he had become president, and if you were to take, what would you have done about, what key policy changes, I guess I'll ask it this way, would you have tried to implement?
So here was our deal. OMB directors are as powerful as presidents let them be. They either back them or they don't. That's it. John understood that we had to make fundamental changes to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the key planks of the social safety net that are really important in America, but which are financially quite fragile and the source of a lot of red ink. And that changing them would be difficult, but he had a history of being able to broker deals in the Senate. He believed he could get the sort of bipartisan piece of it done. But there would have to be someone who was the public face of being the Grinch. And I said, I will take that job because I don't have a political future.
You would have done OMB.
Absolutely. And
Okay.
and the deal was I would be the public face of entitlement reform because it would be unpleasant and people would not like it.
Wow.
And then he could fire me.
Wow.
And that'd be fine because it has to get done. And you don't want the political fallout on the president. Cabinet officials are disposable. That's their job.
So let's just stay on that and roll forward to today. So if you were in a position today, which I know the deficit is worse.
It's terrible.
And we've got all the other issues with slowing, aging workforce, sluggish productivity, probably lack of investment in education. We believe in skills training, underinvestment in infrastructure. What would you be proposing? Can I ask, what would you be proposing today?
So right now, there's no way around it. To my friends on the right, and I'm a member of the vast right-wing conspiracy, charter member. We're going to have to raise revenue. I'm sorry, you can't grow your way out of this. It won't work. There's no way. So the question is, how can you intelligently raise revenue? And the discussion has to be about the quality of tax policy, not taxes up or down. And on the left, you're going to have to deal with the social safety net we have before we do big expansions. Like it is just wrong. So this constitutes a rant, and I just apologize. It is just wrong that the Social Security program is right now scheduled to exhaust the trust fund in about 12 years. And at that point, if nothing was done, there would be a 25% across-the-board cut to people's benefits in their retirements. Okay, so that's wrong. That's no way to run a pension program. And what's worse is Social Security was invented to alleviate income insecurity of seniors. It is now the single greatest source of income insecurity for seniors. That's just terrible.
Just because of doubts about its viability.
Do you know how they're going to fix it?
No,
no one does.
I have some ideas on how
so
they should fix it.
But no one does, and that's wrong.
Yeah,
it should be fixed. And so, we're going to need to do those.
So that
things.
would be high on your list.
Yeah, beneficiaries deserve that. We should have a good program. This is the United States of America. We should have good programs.
So the numbers are from the Congressional Budget Office. When I first started in this job, the present value of unfunded entitlements were $46 trillion. It's up to 59-ish right now.
Okay.
I always think it's a mistake every time I get the number. What's going on? Why is it that this number is skyrocketing at this rate?
So first of all, I don't want you to ever use any of the words you just used.
Okay. All right, good.
There, I got it out. I will never be back. So they're not unfunded liabilities in the sense of a private pension. These are not, the Supreme Court has ruled that we can and will change the structure of these programs. And to say that they're like comparable to unfunded liabilities is to suggest we have to do what's on the books.
Yeah.
And that would be unwise.
Okay.
And that the only solution is to fund them.
I see.
And that's
So you don't think they're going to get funded?
No, we can't fund them. Second thing is you shouldn't believe the numbers.
Okay, good.
Okay.
I feel better.
Here's why. No,
I feel so much better.
Here's why. To get the number, and again, this is a geeky moment I apologize for, you actually have to do this thing where you discount, and to discount you have to have something like an interest rate that is bigger than the growth rate of the thing you're discounting.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Health spending is growing more rapidly than anything you can find a discount with. So the correct number is infinity.
It's worse.
Yeah.
So you think actually the discount,
like Buzz Lightyear math.
The discount the discount rate they're using is probably even.
No, what they have to do is they have to say somewhere out there, and let's pick year 50, the growth rate of health spending comes down to say 1% above GDP growth rate, or maybe comes down to GDP. And so then now it's growing slow enough that you can actually get a number.
But that's going to take policy changes.
The number hinges critically on what year it starts to slow down, how fast it slows down. And I used to make those numbers up in the shower. You don't want to use, for policy purposes, any number where I'm saying year 55 this year.
So just to be clear, so
the more important thing is this.
Yeah.
Right now, this is the line for spending, and this is the line for revenue.
Right.
And they diverge as far as the eye can see.
Right.
That needs to be fixed.
And how would you fix it?
I'd do Social Security first because Social Security is money in, money out. There are 1,000 ways to fix it.
Right.
And
raising the retirement age.
Do something.
Means testing.
Get something done. Yes.
Both.
You can do it. Raise the fraction of wages that are covered by the Social Security payroll tax rate. There are a lot of things you can do, and it can be fixed. Then you get to the really, really hard thing, which is healthcare spending at the federal level, which is in Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act. It's eating the Pentagon budget alive with their health benefits. They have the same problem in small that the federal government has in large. Yeah. And there we don't have real clean and easy solutions. So do the one you can do and then get started on Medicare, as quickly as you can.
Bipartisan commission?
A bipartisan something.
Okay.
This.
But first order of business is to study it and lay out options.
I think we've studied a lot. I think they need to get to work.
Okay. So they need to lay out options.
Yeah. So in the big picture, this is what's gone wrong with the federal level. In the 90s, we had deficits and they took them seriously and they managed to get the budget to balance for 3 years.
Yeah.
Into surplus. And the way they did it was, one, the world became a safer place. Follow the Soviet Union, a big defense procurement holiday, freed up money. They put caps on the annual spending of Congress, the discretionary spending, defense and non-defense. That was the bulk of federal spending at the time.
Yeah.
And we got a productivity boom.
Yeah.
And a big revenue bubble that came out of it.
And they raised taxes a little bit.
A little bit, but more than anything else. And the baby boom generation was 2 decades away from retirement.
Yeah.
We're not in that world.
Better demographics.
We're not in that world. They're retiring. The world's not a safer place.
Yeah.
We don't have a productivity boom.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have to deal with the part of the budget that is now the largest part, which is the entitlement programs, which they didn't touch then. And so you saw them when this came up recently, they put caps on. They ran the same playbook. They said, we'll put caps on annual spending. And then every 2 years, they would just spit the bit on the caps. Got to deal with the real problem.
So you must get asked this all the time, and I can guess this is a dumb question. So the prognosis for addressing these issues and what happens if we don't address these issues? So if we keep kicking the can, what are the implications?
So the prognosis is poor.
Because it'd be so unpopular.
And nobody knows there's a problem.
Yeah.
Think about it. And I'll say this as sort of straightforwardly as I can. For 8 years, President Obama told the American people there is no problem with the federal budget that can't be fixed by taxing rich people. And for his 3 years so far, President Trump has told the American people, hey, there's no problem. They have no idea there's a problem. The leader of their country has not said, we have a big issue that might be hard to deal with and you need to know about it. It's because we're going to have to come up with something. That's the necessary first step. And until you get that, like, you go out and propose a Social Security reform, they're going to think you're doing it because
sure,
you're malicious.
Ideological.
Malicious or whatever. So, that has to happen. First thing, public education, that there's a problem. Second thing, ordering strategically of things that can and cannot be done because you have to demonstrate success to be given permission to keep going. So that's why I think Social Security is really important.
Yeah.
You can get that. If you want to start small, start with Social Security disability. There's a lot of things that could be used, that could be fixed. And the key thing is that if we don't, we will be incurring costs. People think these large deficits aren't damaging because we're not Greece, Portugal. Absence of a crisis is not success. Being a C student is just not like what we're aiming for here. And we give up some potential better future every time we burden the economy with more debt. And we're at 75%, we're headed to 100. And we have, as a result, a lot of interest costs that are eating up a huge chunk of the budget. They're going to be bigger than the Pentagon in 6 years.
Yeah.
That's not a productive use of the money. So we're incurring costs. We're losing budgetary flexibility. We've got our money in the wrong places. We don't do infrastructure investments or anything for the future. And out there in a hidden way, which is like the termites in the woodwork, we're weakening our capacity for both economic growth and the response to any recession. So it's not a pretty picture in my view.
And one reason we get away with this is the dollar's at the moment the world's reserve currency, and people are overweight.
Yes.
And we've talked a lot about if that ever changes, then we'd have a crisis. Then we'd have a crisis.
Yeah. Those would be the same thing.
Yeah. And so sitting where you're sitting now, and you founded something a number of years ago, the American Action Forum, where you're sitting now, I take it you have as a high priority in your life to go out there and talk about these issues and try to raise awareness?
Yeah. So this is the advertisement for the American Action Forum. I at the end of the McCain campaign, I was a lot of things, but the most important was unemployed. And I had to figure out what I was going to do. And I realized, I came to this realization that at CEA, at CBO, and on the McCain campaign, I had done policy research, policy education, policy options, policy advice, but you did it in a very particular way. You worked on whatever happened that day. You did not have the luxury of saying, it's not what I do. I do turtle migration. When that comes up, give me a call. Like, whatever happened, you did it. And you had to deliver your product in English to non-specialists, so a high premium on communication. And you had to understand the political lay of the land. Like CBO nonpartisan by statute, McCain campaign, reasonably partisan enterprise. At the White House, it's always defending the president's program. That's all. That's what you do. So you figure out the politics of it and try to make what you're trying to get to good politics. I decided there was value to that outside of my sort of government clients. So I thought I'll do that for the American people. And so we're a center-right. I'm a market-oriented economist. We're a center-right think tank. We tell people that so that they understand who we are.
Yeah.
And we analyze and try to educate on policies across the spectrum, domestic and economic, from that perspective to sort of raise awareness of problems. And when I started a think tank, I thought we'd write all these papers which had clever solutions, like Social Security reform plan. 90% of our success comes from just explaining how things work.
Right.
People don't understand the federal budget. They don't understand programs like Medicare Part D. What is that? Yeah. And so most of the time we're just teaching. And that's a valuable enterprise.
How big an organization is this?
I have 25 full-time employees. It's a weird place because
a number of economists.
So the traditional think tank is a college campus without students. So you hire deep subject matter experts. Yeah. And you let them sit in their offices. Periodically, the world collides with them. They become relevant, and off you go. I have 20 and 30-somethings who have a master's, some experience on the Hill maybe. They know who those deep subject matter experts are. Yeah. And know to call them when they don't know enough. Yeah. But we chase the issues. We're not sitting there thinking, whatever's happening, we want to weigh in on behalf of good policy on those things.
And who's consuming what you're producing?
Our target audience is really Hill staff and members, and then the agencies increasingly in the regulatory process.
And given you work so much with Hill staff, and I know enough to be dangerous because we go up there and visit regularly, when they read your work, or you talk to elected and appointed officials, their reaction right now to you is what?
Well, you're right, Doug, but
What do they say again?
You're right, Doug, but and then they don't finish the sentence. And I try to figure out what I'm supposed to know.
And then they trail off, phone goes dead.
Yeah.
They're just frustrated.
There's an enormous amount of frustration.
Yeah, and we hear the same thing.
So I mean, it's remarkable when you meet individual by individual with senators and congressmen. There are so many very impressive people. But somehow the collective is so much less than the individuals. I mean, it's remarkable.
And I gather you don't have a lot of meetings where people are pushing back against anything you're saying. Or do you? Or say, that's not true, or yes, but...
There's some pushback. I mean, sort of how you go forward on healthcare is not just politically contentious. Yeah. There are very strong views across so not everyone agrees. Okay. And that's fair.
All right, let's stop here for a moment. Let's take questions from the audience, and I'll come back and ask a few at the end, but please use the mic.
I'm James Galbraith. I teach at the LBJ School, and I was at one point executive director of the Joint Economic Committee.
Yes.
And Doug, as you know, one of the great repeatedly mistaken forecasts of our time is the annual projection that's made by the CBO that long-term interest rates are going to rise. And that just doesn't happen. And that is a major force driving these scare projections in the federal budget. So I guess I have a two-part question. One is, why is it that you, as a market-oriented economist, have more faith in those government projections than you do in the judgment of the market about the value of U.S. government bonds and their creditworthiness? So, secondly, great many of your mainstream colleagues, and I'd refer to Olivier Blanchard, Larry Summers, and others, have said that we ought to take advantage of these low long-term rates and use the capital resources that can be mobilized to deal with the climate crisis, to deal with our infrastructure problem. Right. So I wonder where you stand on that, and if you're opposed to it. My final question relates to the caption of a Hamilton cartoon, of which I have the original, and it's a woman talking to her husband, who I'm afraid to say looks rather like you. And the caption is,
"That's very sad for him."
How does it feel to be one of the last hardliners left in place?
So on the interest rate issue, I'm not there now. I don't know how they're thinking about the interest rate issue, but certainly the way we produced the economic forecasts was to sort of think in-house, and there's a macro division that thinks about this whole time. Then there's a panel of economic advisors, which includes many people who work in New York, the financial markets, former Fed officials, people who we believe would be smart about asset markets and global capital markets, and get them to sort of critique the forecast, and what comes out is the thing you dislike. But that's the process. And it's like all consensus forecasting exercises open to some issues. There's no doubt. It's also true that CBO is, I would say this is fair, as an organization, very conservative. It changes slowly and with great difficulty. I have my own management scars from that. And so it won't move its forecast dramatically. Because to do so would create drama for Congress. A dramatic move in a forecast means a dramatic move in the budget numbers, which means they're being forced by CBO to do something, perhaps. They don't like that. And so that's not always right. I want to just acknowledge that. Second thing I probably forgot, but interest costs are an important part of what's going on, but the primary deficits are a comparable, if not bigger, part of it. The difference between taxes and spending, I think both are going to have to change. I just do. The Blanchard, Olivier made news in the small circles we run in because he gave the presidential address for the American Economic Association. Get your copy. I encourage you to. And he made the following observation that, in most places at most times, interest rates are lower than the growth rate of the economy and not the reverse. That was actually really important to know because for people like me who grew up professionally in the 70s and 80s, that wasn't true. And I didn't think that was true. And it turns out the era I grew up in was the exception, not the norm. And it is true that if interest rates are lower than the growth rate of the economy and you've got some debt out there and the economy is growing, your debt to GDP ratio is going to decline even if you do nothing because the growth rate in the economy takes care of that and the interest costs can't defeat it. So that was a very important observation. From that have come sort of a cottage industry of just sort of how much can we ignore this because interest rates are low. And so Larry Summers and Jason Furman wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs that basically said this: you don't need to deal with the deficit problem. Don't worry about it. Anything you do, pay for, don't make it worse, but you don't need to worry about it. And so that's basically sort of says, go out 10 years, the debt to GDP ratio will be 100%, we'll be okay. I guess I disagree on the political economy of that because the kind of primary deficit changes you'd have to make to stabilize debt to GDP at 100% 10 years from now amount to like $320 billion every year, $3.2 trillion over 10. And I don't think I want to back Congress into that corner. So that's just a judgment.
Yes, sir.
I'm here in behalf of Leroy and Barbie Ide. We've attended 4 or 5 Federal Reserve meetings. And we were at the one that was 0.9 trillion and it moved up to whatever the number is, 5 something. And I've been watching closely that you got it down to 3.9. I'm proud of you.
You're talking about the balance sheet?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Now, I watch all this and I have 2 questions. And I think you gentlemen are beyond anything in my pay grade. How many newspapers do you read a day? 1. And 2, have you watched Tony Sebo, Technology Disruption? 31 minutes of your time.
Okay. So this one's Wall Street Journal, New York Times,
Yes.
FT.
Yes.
And yeah, I not only have watched that on disruption, but we've done 2 conferences at the Dallas Fed. We're about to do our 3rd. Mark Wynn, who's our sponsor tonight, is the organizer, where we spend 2.5 days just talking about technology-enabled disruption, because we think it's such a big driver of what we're seeing in the U.S. economy, particularly as it relates not just to business, but to education and skill levels and lack of investment in human capital. So we could talk a lot about that, and we'd invite you to look up our conference, which we're going to have now June 25th and 26th. Anyhow, let me turn to you.
So in addition to those, I read the Washington Post as a matter of survival. And then I read the USA Today to see what real people read. Because the articles are uncorrelated. It's really important to look at that. Because the business we're in and communicating in English to non-specialists, that's important. Try to figure out what they're actually doing.
All right, Tyson Tuttle, new board member of the San Antonio Fed.
All right, thank you very much. And I'm with Silicon Labs here in Austin. We're a technology company. We do business globally. We have a headquarters in Singapore. Our manufacturing's offshore. And we were talking a little bit earlier about the corporate tax reform bill, and as part of the last tax bill. And that's largely misunderstood about how that equalized our corporate tax rate with other countries. And I was wanting you to maybe comment a little bit about that did bring corporate tax revenue down, which is counter to the deficit goals that you've been talking about. But to what extent over the longer term you think that's going to have on the U.S. economy and productivity growth? So
I spent a lot of time on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, beginning with the House had a set of initiatives that Paul Ryan had set up to develop policies on healthcare reform, tax reform, regulatory reform. And so that panel I worked with a lot. It was dedicated to a pretty radical business tax reform, a revenue neutral, very pro-investment reform, which when the Trump administration came in got picked up as part of the efforts on corporate tax reform. Prior to 2017, there was a bipartisan consensus that we had to do something with the corporation income tax. We were losing, if you think back, we were losing headquartered companies at a rate of like 10 to 15 a year, the Pfizers of the world, and we'd get these Benedict Arnold company stories, and the Treasury tried to write regs, and it needed to be fixed. And so the most important thing it did was get the top rate into the middle of the pack for developed countries at 21%, by no means the lowest. It moved the U.S. away from taxing the global profits of U.S. headquartered firms to taxing the U.S. profits of U.S. headquartered firms. That's what everyone else does. That's a, quote, territorial system, so that when U.S. and German firms compete in Brazil, they're both just paying the Brazilian tax, and it's a level playing field. And it improved the incentives for investment, both the level and the location in the U.S. Those are all permanent changes. I think they were necessary and valuable and will prove to be durable contributions to the economy. It's hard to tell how big they've been so far because they barely finished writing the regulations, and we have other things going on, you may have noticed. So we'll see. The rest of the tax code, if you do something for corporations, you have to do something for pass-throughs, because more than 1/2 of business income in the U.S. is taxed as pass-throughs, partnerships or subchapter S corporations, things like that. So there had to be a second piece of reform as well for them. I'm not as thrilled with what they came down on there. Could have been better, but I'm a former editor of the National Tax Journal. I have very high standards on tax reform. You should subscribe, by the way. Great read. And then the individual stuff I didn't think was as important. That was a political promise by the president, but I didn't think that had the same growth impacts. It wasn't as important for the long run things that face the U.S.
So how's the trade tensions, escalating trade tensions, tariffs impacted the effectiveness, you think, of this corporate tax reform?
I think it's had an unambiguously negative effect. We saw, we don't have, definitive proof. Like no one really knows. So we're all operating on our instincts. But beginning in the fall of 2018, particularly in the third and fourth quarters, the C-suite, CEO, CFO confidence plummeted. It's below 2016 levels now. And that coincides with the ramping up of the trade wars and the tensions that came from it. Every survey mentions it if you talk to them.
That's what we see too.
So, how big? I've seen estimates of 0.5 percentage point of growth. Who knows?
So it could be, as you're pointing out, that it's too soon to judge this corporate tax reform because we've had the escalating trade tensions.
There are going to be a lot of PhD dissertations written on this thing before we're done. But you need more data and figure out what was the trade component, what was the short-term component, the long-term component. It's going to be difficult.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Griffin Goss. I'm a student of economics and philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. And you mentioned that when you advise people on the Hill from your think tank, you mentioned that you meet a lot of bright individuals, but their brightness is lost when it comes to the collective. Do you think that that's a subsequent problem with a dual-party system or a democracy, or is that just maybe something that happens in any kind of governmental bureaucracy?
It's a really good question, and I don't have a 100% satisfying answer to it. I will say that I believe that mechanically bipartisanship in Congress begins in the White House. Only the White House can do a couple of things, and notably Bill Clinton was really good at this. So here would be an example, right? He would say, "This is an important problem. We need to deal with it. I'm sending to Congress legislation." So what has that done? Number one, the one person elected by everybody said this has to be dealt with. So they're not saying we decided to do this. They're like, the president said we have to work on this. I didn't want to. And he said this is the right solution. So he's got some air cover. They don't own the solution. They can then, in committees, fix it and claim victory that he's setting up something flawed. They did better. The White House can then go to their party or go to the other party and say, what do you want in this? And say, I promise I won't sign unless that's in there. They're the only ones who can broker a deal like that. And the most important thing is to go to their own party and say, look, I get it. You don't like this. This is a bad vote. We'll campaign for you. We'll help you with your other legislation, whatever it is. And they're the only ones who can do that kind of deal making. Reagan was good at that. Clinton was good at that. W was not good at that. I worked for him. I admire the man. I thought he was tremendous in many ways, but that wasn't the way that worked. It was the majority in the House that dictated priorities. President Obama had terrible legislative relations. And I can't even describe how confused the Hill is by President Trump. He provides no air cover. He regularly kneecaps them, and it's just impossible to sort of figure out how to get things done. So I think the mechanics have been wrong for a while. And a president dedicated to getting things done could actually fix a lot of that. But there's also a level of partisanship that's just now been baked into behaviors. It's okay to be callous and demeaning in ways that weren't previously okay in Congress. And I worry about the decline in standards in general. I don't know what you do about that.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, sir.
My name is Masaki Yoshimori. Last week, IMF discussed about R minus G is the interest rate minus growth rate. It's a positive or negative. To think about growth of economy, expanding fiscal.
Could you talk a little bit louder? I can't hear you.
To think about growth of economy, expanding fiscal policy, do you take into account R minus G issue? So it's gross economy rate minus interest rate matter. So now is look at the Japan or ECB, so it's negative. So it's a huge jump.
So I think there are at least two different answers to that question. One is the narrower question of when you think about the budgetary outlook, do you want to build that into it? That got asked before, and the question is undoubtedly yes, and that we haven't sort of thought about that very hard, and we don't often discuss just the primary deficit and its path. That's important. The second is, for the economy as a whole, what do we have to worry about? And for me, I worry about only the growth of GDP per capita, GDP per worker, sort of productivity-related measures, because those signal where our problems arise. From the end of World War II to 2007, we had good enough productivity growth that even with the arrival of the baby boom, the standard of living, GDP per person, crude measure of the standard of living, doubled every 35 years. And so in one working career, the standard of living would double, and that was the path of most Americans to their version of the American dream, whatever they wanted to do. That was my father. Came out of the Navy, went to work in the steel mills in Pittsburgh, rose up through the management ranks, sort of the American dream. And given the state of the U.S. economy now, and most projections, that it doubles 70 to 75 years. And so there's this palpable sense.
Because productivity growth is
so low.
So much lower. Why do we have theories on it? Why do you think productivity growth is so low? I'm happy to share some of ours, but
we don't have enough time for that.
If you had to pick one or two things, what would you throw out to consider?
I think I'd pick growth of the regulatory state, which I think is a big issue.
Okay.
And broad-based increases in competition and barriers to entry on the supply side.
And explain just in layman's language
so
what is that?
if you look at the fraction of firms that account for the majority of sales in markets, that has gone way up in almost every industry in the United States. And so it's not just one thing going on. There's something going on out there, and it's produced some corollary things that make me nervous, like the entry rate of firms fell below the death rate of firms a little while back for the first time ever. So like we only had old firms and they were getting older and we weren't getting new firms to replace them. So that sense of vitality, there's something going on there. But it's a deeper problem than that, because there's huge regional differences. The U.S. now has these very distinct regional
in productivity. So what's interesting is somebody who grew up looking at, I'll ask you that, corporate earnings reports and still does, to my eye, it looks like every business and every industry I look at is dramatically more productive today than 10 years ago.
Dramatically more profitable, which monopoly power can produce.
Yes, fair enough. So that's what you think is going on. Okay. And one of the things we talk a lot about, and I'm curious your reaction at Dallas Fed, is we measure productivity, though, workforce-wide, not by industry.
Right.
And we note that 46 million out of 160 million workforce, 46 million workers out of 160 have a high school education or less, and that they're having a hard time adapting.
It's a huge problem. And here's the scarier part. So I am an economist, so I am the voice of doom. So we do testing in the United States at the 4th and 8th grade level as part of something called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a humorous name since there is none. And so for 10 years, it has been true that if you look at reading and math skills of 4th and 8th graders, the best we can do is get 45% of them to be proficient at grade level reading and math. So not even half.
Right.
So we are seriously failing our children, and they will be the labor force of the future, and they will be in trouble.
So we're sitting in Texas, and this is why one of the reasons why there was been education reform in the state, which is welcome.
Good.
Because our problem's been masked by migration, but we're very concerned about this. We look up North Canada; their reading scores are actually dramatically higher than the United States. Okay, yes, sir.
My name is Mohan Karbanda. You mentioned GDP per capita as one of the key measures, but that masks the inequality in the sense that Gini coefficient is the highest it has been since 1920s. Business concentration by one measure is the highest since 1940s. You think they need to be addressed going forward as one of the policy decisions?
So it is true that GDP per capita misses the inequality. That's absolutely true. No measure is perfect, but it's still, the decline in the growth of that concerns me in and of itself. There's an enormous war over policies toward wealth and income inequality. Everyone's familiar with that. The thing I find troubling about the discussion is that there is a piece of inequality about which everyone, I think, should agree, and that is poverty is unacceptable. People ought to have the ability to support themselves, that have the skills to be economically self-sufficient, and you could stop fighting about the rich people and do something about the poor people, and we are doing nothing. We're not fixing the schools, we're not fixing the social safety net, we're not worried about the job skills that they now need to get later in life. We've done meager things to fix criminal justice reform and give a big chunk of the American population a chance. I think all of that should be the top priority.
And how would you fund it?
There are two problems with the federal budget. One's the mismatch, which we've discussed. The second is the structure is all wrong. So the entitlement programs, which are legacy programs that largely serve elderly people, are now 70% of spending. And the annual discretionary spending, which is the place where you do infrastructure, education, basic research, national security, all the things our founders thought were the role of government, are steadily getting squeezed out. You have to free up room in the budget to spend more on discretionary accounts. I mean, there's no way around that. We're making big mistakes. That's the only place where you can improve the future.
That makes sense. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm a concerned undergraduate. Today, Jerome Powell went up to Congress, and in his testimony, he didn't seem particularly confident in the monetary and fiscal outlook, particularly because I guess he stated that the Fed was sort of running out of the resources to control some of the financial and sustainability that Congress was not dealing with. My question, and I'm sorry for this, is everything going to be okay? And if not, how bad will it get?
Everything's going to be okay. I believe that deeply. I'm a fundamentally optimistic person, despite the fact that I was born without a soul and trained as an economist. I mean, you know, Winston Churchill said it famously, Americans can be counted on to do the right thing after they've tried everything else, and we have a long, long history of, in a very pragmatic fashion, solving problems. And that means you stop pointing fingers and you sit down and you do something that both sides dislike at some level, but which is a step forward, and we're going to do that, just not this year, and you should know that.
So I'll make one other comment, and what Chairman Powell, I should more appropriately say, is I think maybe part of what's behind this, what he's discussing, and one of the things we talk a lot about is over the last, pick a 10 years, the bulk of economic policy in this country has been monetary policy. Certainly the case in Europe. In our long history, and Doug can comment on this, that's not been the way it's been. We've had broad policy. Monetary policy's had a role to play, but you have fiscal policy, structural reforms. And one of the things that I think is important for us to call out is we'll do our part, but if we're going to address these issues and grow faster and deal with some of these looming issues Douglas has talked about, we need structural reforms, fiscal policy, and broader action beyond monetary policy. And I think the Fed does a positive service to the country to call that out and say, we'll do our role, but there are limits to the role of monetary policy. And I think that's a good thing.
So I want to expand on that. I think that's an important part of the process that people don't appreciate. He went up there and said that to basically, in a quiet way, tell Congress they needed to get their act together. And that's true. And he did it, I think, in a dignified way, just raised the awareness of this. That's how these things turn out. When I was at CBO, people used to say to me all the time, you projected $600 billion. It didn't turn out to be $600 billion. It was $300 billion. You're always wrong. It was $300 billion because we said it was going to be 600 and they had to frickin' fix it. We were part of the process. And so, you know, that's what goes on. And it's a good thing when that process starts to sort of gear up.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Johnson Elrod. I'm a senior at Southwestern University, so another concerned undergraduate. One of my questions is, I worked in an investment bank. We're on the capital markets team that covered a mortgage portfolio. So one of our big arguments was the prevalence or magnitude of the financial or economic pressures from climate change. So I'm curious as to your opinion on what you think that magnitude is. And then two, we've kind of spoken about, the solvency of Social Security and some of the things you would do with healthcare. And he kind of brought up a second ago, how else would you kind of specifically raise revenues for things like education infrastructure? I would love for you to dive deeper into that if you could. So those are kind of my two questions there.
Sure. So on climate, I don't know, is the honest answer. But there are lots and lots of very solid efforts on the economics of climate change. There was an effort put together by Hank Paulson and Michael Paul, Risky Business, that I worked on and produced some economic impact scenarios. They differ a lot regionally. It's real easy to see if you live on the coast and you got sea level rise, some big impacts there. I think one of the things we ought to do, one of my pet projects at the moment, is I think start with publicly traded companies. There should be disclosures against the financial risks from climate change and climate change policies. Right? Like if you're a coal company, you should disclose the fact that you could be put out of business quickly. That's a no-brainer. That would allow us, I think, to get a better handle on some of these things. We'd have better measurement, and also it would, I think, stimulate action to actually deal with this problem in some sensible way. Right now, there are some companies who do this, but what they say is we're going to do it consistent with the IPCC having a 2.5 degree temperature rise by 2050, and there are an infinite number of ways to get to that. So there ought to be a standardized set of sort of climate scenarios with climate policy scenarios, and everyone should disclose their financial risks against them. We'd know a lot more about the impacts then. In terms of raising revenue, the thing you want to do, if at all possible, is continue the march toward genuine tax reform, which is always keep rates as low as possible and have the base be as broad as possible. There's an enormous amount that was not done in 2017 in base broadening. They should do it. And if they do all that and there's not enough revenue, then you're going to have to raise rates. But the intersection of those two things is using a carbon tax as your primary way to limit emissions of greenhouse gases. That is the right way to go from an economics point of view, and that can be a source of additional revenue as well.
Thank you.
And interestingly, on the carbon tax, we had, as you said, Greg Mankiw, we had Glenn Hubbard. It's got pretty bipartisan support. It might surprise people who's supporting it. A number of people who have been thought of as Republican economists, but pretpretty bipartisan.
I think we are.
And
you think we're not economists or not?
So what do you make? So why isn't it getting more traction among policymakers then?
I think it's pretty simple. On the McCain campaign, this is also an interesting piece of education for me. John McCain had a cap and trade proposal to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Barack Obama also had a cap and trade proposal. They were virtually identical. I mean, we made a big deal about the differences, but they were about the same thing. And I thought this was going to be fantastic because the first time, two people running for president were saying we should do this. It got no attention whatsoever.
Right.
And the lesson is we evaluate these political races on the differences, not the commonalities. And if McCain hadn't had one, they'd have talked about Obama's as a difference, and it would have gotten more attention, or vice versa. But it got almost no attention.
Okay.
The only thing that happened after that was there was an effort by Waxman and Markey under Obama. They had a bill in the House, which was a cap and trade, and it was not a good bill, objectively. It was also a political nightmare, and it destroyed the brand of cap and trade, which is one market-oriented way to do these things. It's what we did in 89, 90 with the acid rain program when I was at the White House the first time. That's a cap and trade. That's gone. You can't do that. So the only thing left that is using price signals and economic incentives to mitigate emissions is a carbon tax. And that's why you're seeing people migrate to it.
Okay. So we've got a group of concerned citizens here. They're obviously here tonight, which shows they have an interest in either in you and economics, and I think in public policy. If you had to give this group of leaders one piece of advice on an action they could take that might help address some of these issues, what should people in this audience go out there and do?
So when I think about the economy, all roads lead to productivity, which is a boring topic, but you want to design your policies, whether they're climate mitigation policies or regulatory policies, to sort of maximize the size of that pie that we're going to need to deal with all our pressing issues and to have good innovation incentives. When I think about public policy, all the constraints run through the federal budget. And, there's just not enough money. And people don't know that. And so I think you should explain to people that not through some sort of malfeasance or any bad intent, we have overpromised and we are under-resourced and it needs to get fixed. And that's the number one thing we face.
And people in this audience should go out and do what?
Just educate people. Just say, you should understand this is an issue. No one's talking about this. Everyone's saying don't worry about this, but this is going to dictate the options your children have.
And we're seeing
think about that. This is really wrong. This is another thing.
Yeah.
Tiny rage moment. This is a representative democracy.
Right.
It's not a crazy thing that this generation of voters wants to have a paid parental leave program, for example.
Right.
It's not a crazy idea.
Right.
There's no money. It's all been locked in by decisions made in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that's just not okay.
Yep.
I just think it should be fixed.
Okay. And let me just comment. So one of the things we're trying to do here at the Dallas Fed, but I'd say role of the Fed, obviously we make monetary policy decisions, we supervise the banks, we do payments, as we try to use our economic research to best we can, similar to what you're trying to do, explain, diagnose what we think going on, even if it's away from monetary policy. You're trying to do the exact same thing.
Yes, and in doing that, I'm probably the leading producer of heroic estimates.
Yeah.
Because I believe there's very large public policy value to identifying whether something's a 10 billion problem, 100 billion, or a trillion.
Right.
And so let's get the magnitudes right.
Get the magnitude, dimensions.
Get the magnitudes right so that we have a finite amount of problem-solving ability. We've seen that.
Yeah.
Let's pick big problems.
So we have a megaphone at the Dallas Fed, maybe this big. Other parts, the Fed generally maybe this big. You have a megaphone. You probably doesn't feel as big as you'd like. And I don't know about you. I was about to say we're both doing this work, and I pick up the paper every day. I don't see a lot written about these points.
This is going to be all over the New York Times tomorrow. Yeah. I know. I'm confident.
But they are very interested in knowing what we're going to do with rates in the next meeting.
Yes.
Is there any suggestions? What can be done so this message breaks through, other than just continue to work at it and work at it and work at it? What's your philosophy on how we can get greater public awareness so we have a better chance to address these issues?
I'm a big believer that that elections are our teachable moments. Okay. They are the point at which people stop doing what they should do, which is run their lives, and turn toward running the country.
Yeah.
And so elections ought to be, in my view, policy-rich experiences which illustrate to people what the problems are and the kinds of solutions and allow them to learn about that. That's not what we saw, certainly in 2016, and we may not see that in 2020.
But it's a window for it.
But it's the window, and that's the window where if you can get people, they're paying attention, that's when you want to get your stuff out there, have people pay attention to it. I just want to say, this just came back to me. This
Please.
Is a flashback. Is there still a Dallas Friday Club? It was a civic organization of some sort?
Well, James is nodding yes.
When I was CBO director, I was invited to speak at lunch at the Dallas Friday Club, and I went down there, and I went through the then apocalyptic budget projections, which are nothing like now. Yeah. And there was this woman who was just enraged, and she was like, "This is terrible. This is awful. Why aren't you telling people?" And I'm like, "This is all I do."
So on that happy note,
so I'm back.
Let me just say, we're thrilled to have you here in
you.
Texas. We thank you for your leadership. Keep doing what you're doing. And we really appreciate your leadership on these matters in the United States.
Thank you.